Ladies and gentlemen, it's Tuesday. It's such a beautiful day. And let me just say this. Everybody buckle up for a mind-bending journey as we welcome the one and only Dr. David Salomon, a professor whose creativity flows like a river of ideas, carving new channels in the world of art and imagination, whose brilliance cast a radiant glow on the path of artistic exploration, a virtuoso of originality, painting vivid landscapes that captivate the hearts of all of those who encounter him. Dr. David Salomon, I'm so thankful you're here today. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on who you are and where you're from.
Well, George, first I got to correct you. It's Wednesday, not Tuesday. But second, will you give my eulogy at my funeral, please? Because that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Yes, I am a professor of medieval literature, religion, culture. Have been for over 3 decades. I'm currently the Director of Research and Creative Activity at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, where my office facilitates undergraduate research and creative opportunities for students across the institution. And I continue to teach in our honors program and our museum studies program, and written a bunch of books. My most recent book is on the 7 deadly sins. And I started in graduate school really on the track for my dissertation, interested in English mysticism. So I think that's where we're going.
Yeah, we have started this new series called the Codex Chronicles. And I find the world of manuscripts and mysticism and religion and spirituality so fascinating. And I'm so thankful to get to talk to you because you speak all these different languages and you can read the text in their original format. And you're just it's a real pleasure to get to talk to you. And I believe that my audience and people are out there are thirsty for this kind of information. And I really believe there's an audience that is loving it. I'm getting a lot of cool emails. So thank you for being here today. We're going to talk about a manuscript today. Maybe you can, the Cloud of the Unknowing. What is this?
Yeah, so the Cloud of Unknowing is probably one of the most famous mystical works. It continues to be very popular today. I imagine that you can probably walk into just about any bookstore and go to the religion section, and they'll probably have a copy of one of the editions on the shelf. We don't know who the author is. Was written in the latter half of the 14th century. So this is the height of really of English mysticism, 14th century English mysticism. There's a flurry of activity. And I think in the coming weeks, we're going to talk about some of the different works and authors. And the Cloud of Unknowing is one of those, originally written in Middle English. So a little bit unusual in that. We're starting to see, by the time we get to the 14th century in England, these works being written more in the vernacular and not being written just in Latin. So they are intended, it would seem, for a broader audience. There are 17 known manuscripts of this work. So it was, it survives. 2 of the best known are in the British Library and Cambridge University Library. As I say, we don't know who the author is. He's probably a priest. He's certainly a spiritual director, because that's how he is addressing the work, as someone who is overseeing the spiritual direction of an individual. He clearly knows his Thomas Aquinas. He knows the Greeks. It wasn't as popular a work at the time as some of the other ones that we're going to discuss in the coming weeks, because it was addressed to solitaries who were really on advanced levels of the mystical journey. And so that wasn't, Joe Schmo walking on the street. These are people who are seriously involved in engaging in this kind of work and this kind of life. And probably the best way that we can kind of set up what this is all about is just to kind of give a really brief paradigm of what that mystical journey is. Right. And so this is there's a very famous work called Mysticism, written by Evelyn Underhill. Evelyn Underhill, English scholar, herself a spiritual individual. And this work, which she published in 1911, in many ways became the standard text. And really, if you're going to study mysticism, from an academic perspective, this is, I think, the first place that you really have to go. And in the work, she very clearly outlines that there are essentially 3 stages in the mystical journey. The first one she calls illumination. So it's, as the name sort of indicates, the light bulb comes on, right? This is what this is. This is, available to me. This is possible. And then the next stage is more active. It's purgation. You have to purge the self of the things that are getting in the way, for lack of another way of putting it. And that it brings you then to the third level, which is the ultimate goal here, which is the unitive union with the divine. And what that looks like and what that means, obviously up for lots of discussion. But the Cloud of Unknowing fits in a kind of an odd spot in the history of mystical literature, because it is one of the earliest pieces in English that really advocates for what's called negative theology. So the author is interested in negative theology, what is called in the literature apophatic theology, which is basically looking at God and the divine through negation rather than affirmation. The approach here is that the divine is ineffable. We can't explain it. We don't know what it is. Any words are going to fail us because it's beyond human language. And so as a result, the approach is to take a complete 180 and say, well, let's talk about what it isn't. And that's really what negative theology is about. And it's an important approach. It's an important approach. So that was a lot by way of introduction. I'm sorry about that.
Not at all. It's very informative, and I think it's imperative that we lay a foundation for people so they can begin to understand it. And it's in some ways, it reminds me of Alfred North Whitehead, where he talks about mysticism, clarification, action. I've never thought about putting a negative theology on there, but it's an interesting way. And it seems that just the title alone, The Cloud of the Unknowing, it's kind of foreshadowing how they're going to figure it out a little bit, right?
And I mean, surprisingly, from the description that I just gave, it sounds like, oh my gosh, this must be so complicated. It's actually 75 very short chapters. The chapters, quote unquote, are a few paragraphs. It's very readable, but it is very, very complex. And, I went back and pulled my copy off the shelf in advance of our discussion. And it was interesting because I have to say, I haven't revisited this text personally in many, many years. And just to go through and see what I underlined and the notes that I made myself is always kind of interesting. But, I think the author really sets up everything in the 4th chapter when he really talks about what that cloud is. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read the paragraph.
Please.
So he refers to this as being a darkness, right? Everyone talks about the divine as being light. And he says, actually, it's darkness. But he says, and I quote, "Do not think that because I call it a darkness or a cloud, it's the sort of cloud you see in the sky, or the kind of darkness you know at home when the light's out. That kind of darkness or cloud you can picture in your mind's eye in the height of summer, just as in the depth of winter's night you can picture a clear and shining light. I do not mean this at all. By darkness, I mean a lack of knowing. Just as anything that you do not know or may have forgotten may be said to be dark to you, for you cannot see it with your inward eye. For this reason, it's called a cloud, not of the sky, of course, but of unknowing, a cloud of unknowing between you and your God." And I just think that's really, it's counterintuitive to what we do as human beings because we're so intellectual. And certainly there is a tremendous pathway in the mystical literature for the intellect and the role of the intellect. But almost all of the writers in the Middle Ages will all say that the intellect is only going to get you so far. At some point, you got to let go. And America picked up on this, right? I mean, I always talk about this with my students when we do a broad discussion of spirituality. If you get a dollar bill out, if anybody still carries dollar bills, and you look at the seal on the back, the pyramid with the eye of God at the top, there's a lot of symbolism in that seal. But one of the things is that intelligence can only get you so far. There are 21 stages there, which the 21 is the age of reason. And then there's a gap between the top of the pyramid and the eye of God, because reason's not going to get you there, right? That's the leap of faith. And in many ways, that's what the author here is talking about. You're going to get to a certain point, and then you're going to get to this darkness, this cloud of unknowing, which for us as human beings, especially today in our ultra, rational world, we want to know and want to understand everything. And the author is saying, you're not going to understand this. You got to give yourself over to it.
It's mind-blowing to me, because it seems to me, and as someone who's not a scholar in this area, you can really begin to see that break, whether it's that leap of faith. But when the way you're explaining it, and when I hear about some of the medieval mystics, it seems that there was a break between people actually having real mystical experiences and then trying to put them down versus an interpretation of one.
Yeah, well, and of course, we got to stop right there and say real mystical experience.
Yeah, I know.
What does that mean? Right. If it's real to you, I mean,
Right.
because a mystical experience is something which is so incredibly personal.
Right.
It's really, you really can't say to somebody, oh, well, you didn't have that experience. Right. It's the thing we run into when people are saying, well, I'm really depressed. And they're saying, oh, don't feel that way. It's like, well, that doesn't help. You don't know what that's like. So, I think there's an interesting change that occurs, to be sure. I mean, in a lot of the earlier theologians in Augustine and Aquinas and Bernard of Clairvaux, and a lot of the earlier Christian theologians, and that's where I'm staying at the moment, is with Christianity. Although it's not exclusively there, but those guys all did have what they would claim to be mystical experiences as part of their biographies. It was a gateway for them to higher intellect. Whereas for a lot of these mystics that we're talking about, such as the author of the Cloud of Unknowing, it isn't really a gateway to higher intellect. It's a gateway to love of the divine exclusively. So whereas somebody like Aquinas is so intellectual, and I mean, his work is just incredible. It's informed by his experience of the divine. Sometimes a mystic will stop there. And so we'll see that with a couple of the writers that we're going to look at, where you're right. I mean, they are interested in relaying the experience more than interpreting what it means. And for others, I mean, the author of the Cloud of Unknowing does not claim to be, quote unquote, a mystic. I don't know that anybody can claim to be a mystic. I mean, what does that mean? You can't exactly look up the job description in the occupational handbook, and I always joke with students and I say, try putting that down on your IRS tax return under profession, and good luck. You really can't. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And by the same token, and I think the author of our text today also would argue this, you can't set out to say, I want that to happen. I want to have a mystical experience. Because as just about every mystical writer will tell you, including folks like Evelyn Underhill and the scholars, these experiences come uninvited. That doesn't mean that one can't prepare oneself for it. And that's what many of these handbooks, and really that's what the Cloud of Unknowing is, are teaching you to do, to prepare yourself, body and soul, right? Intellect as well, for this experience. And if it happens, fantastic, congratulations. But I mean, they're all clear on the fact that this isn't going to happen to everybody. In fact, I mean, the Cloud author says, this isn't for everybody. Says, I don't even want everybody to read this text. right? I mean, isn't it in the prologue? I think he talks about, he doesn't want sort of average folks reading the text because this isn't for them. What does he say here? There's a great sentence. Let's see if I can find it, where he talks about the fact that he doesn't expect that. Yeah, he says, I do not mind at all if the loud. And this is the wonderful translation by Clifton Walters, and there are lots of translations of the Cloud, obviously. But he says, I do not mind at all if the loudmouthed or flatterers or the mock modest or fault finders, gossips, tittle tattlers, talebearers, or any sort of grumbler never see this book. I've never meant to write for them, so they can keep out of it. And so can all those learned men, and unlearned too, who are merely curious, right? That's not what he's looking for. And so it really becomes clear that his audience, he's got an audience in mind. It's people who are serious about this, who are serious about leading this kind of a life. And, he really sets up the contrast right from the get-go between an active life and a contemplative life.
It's mind-blowing to me just to sit and listen to something like that was written so long ago, and on some level have it be so heartwarming and beautiful and explanatory in so many different ways today. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind, maybe you said that you had revisited this book for the first time in a long time. I'm curious if you could maybe you could check out some of the parts that you underlined when you were there, and then talk about them today and how you feel about them.
Sure. Yeah, I found it interesting as I was looking through it that when you look at things, when you go back and look at a text that you've not worked with in a while, it's always kind of interesting because you pick up new things and you're looking at it through a new lens, right? I know a lot more now than I did when I read this text originally, which was probably close to 30 years ago, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation. And one of the things that I underlined and that I noted was this interesting bit that he has, and it's in chapter 71, where he's talking about Moses. Now, there's a lot about Moses in mystical literature, about Moses, and Gregory of Nyssa, who wrote a life of Moses, is often credited as being a big influence on the writer of the Cloud of Unknowing. And in the life of Moses, and in Philo of Alexandria's life of Moses, which is just a brilliantly written work, both of them talk about Moses as kind of a type, as a prototype, right? He's an exemplar of the mystic for them. And, I love the discussions about him, because in this chapter in the Cloud, he says, before Moses could see the ark and learn how it was to be made, he had to climb with long and toilsome effort to the top of the mountain and remain there and work in a cloud for 6 days, and wait till on the 7th day our Lord condescended to show him the way in which the ark should be made. Moses' long and strenuous efforts and his delayed vision symbolize those who cannot reach the full height of this spiritual work without such preliminary effort and toil. And all of the writers talk about Moses preparing to go up the mountain. We're talking about him going up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, right? And get the instructions on how to build the Ark of the Covenant. And there's a lot in the literature about the preparation that he had to go through before he went up the mountain in order to do this. And that is often looked at as being a model for the mystical journey. But again, he follows this, the Cloud author does, by telling us this isn't going to happen to everybody. He says Moses could only see, in quotes, on rare occasions, and then after much hard work, right? I mean, this is hard work. This is hard work. And, we talk all the time about in the spiritual realms, we talk about it in psychology, about, you got to do the work.
Right.
And the work is hard work. And it is probably harder to do today than it ever has been before because of, the myriad distractions that we have and all the other noise. But I love that image, and it's mostly because as a child, I was really engaged with the story of Moses. I love the Ten Commandments, which actually I talk about that in the Seven Deadly Sins book in the introduction. I grew up in that film, and so Moses was a model for me as well. I didn't even really know why, and then when I would read about all of these writers talking about him as a model for the mystical or spiritual life, and you think about what he has to go through in order to get to that point, and of course, ultimately, if you want to look at the Exodus story, in some ways he fails because he doesn't. I mean, he achieves some kind of union, momentary union with the divine at the burning bush. But really, for him, his goal is to get to the promised land. And the promised land for him is a euphemism for that unity with the divine. And he's denied that. He has to stand on the other side of the river and watch as they leave and go with Joshua across the river. It's an incredible story.
It is an incredible story, and it really colors in the idea of faith. And when you say doing the hard work, like knowing that it's almost unachievable, but doing it anyway, like that's so powerful to
Yeah,
think
yeah,
about. Like
yeah.
it's not going to work, but you
Right,
have to do it, and there's just
right.
that's it.
Because the fact that you don't know it isn't going to work is also a sign of your humility.
Yes.
Right. I mean, if you go into it with that arrogant feeling that I know how to do this, I got this, I really, if we do anything like that, right, oftentimes it blows up in our face. And so, the going into any endeavor with a sense of humility is probably a good thing, which, is what's lacking in so many folks. And I thinking about the folks who often show up in the news, right? I mean, our leaders, right, seem to have, no sense of real humility, and that often backfires on them.
When I think about what we've just spoken about, or some parts that you have read right there, it seems to me that there is something really courageous in sitting with uncertainty. And that to me seems like humility in a way. Like the fact that we seem to find ourselves so certain all the time, or these people that know we're going to do this and this,
Yeah.
like there's something so beautiful in someone who has the courage to sit with uncertainty.
But it is tough.
Oh, it's almost
It's
so
very
scary.
difficult. Yeah. It's frightening. And it just is counterintuitive to who we are, because we're taught to use our rational selves in order to figure things out. We just got, I think I mentioned 2 new kittens, and to watch them as they kind of figure things out, it's interesting.
It is.
They are not willing to sit with uncertainty. They will try just about anything that's possible and fail. And then, the odd thing, of course, is that they don't necessarily always learn from that, where we would hope that, okay, that's not the way to do this or the way to go. But I think that's right. And that uncertainty is part of what I do for a living as being an education, right? I mean, I'm teaching my course this fall coming up on the Bible as literature. And I always have students who come in the first day, the height of arrogance. Oh, I know the Bible, and to which my response is, then why are you taking the class?
Right.
Why are you here? What you say you already know this. You're coming in already so self-assured. What can I teach you? And some of those folks will drop the class, and some will stay in it and will kind of push back. And it's really interesting because to see over the first few weeks of the course, usually, when they start realizing that what they were so certain about, maybe that's not really what they thought it was. And I often encounter it because they've been, a certain story or certain section has been explained to them in some way in the religious school or by their parents. And and I'm approaching this not from a devotional perspective, but from an academic perspective. And I'll explain what the interpretation of this is and what it means, and they will fight me on it and fight me on it. One of my favorites is, and I think we've talked about this before, we talk about the Immaculate Conception,
Mm.
and students think it's the conception of Jesus, and I say no, it's the conception of Mary by Anne, her mother. And oh, no, you're wrong. That just tell me I'm dead wrong. I'm absolutely wrong. And I will also, I go ask your priest on Sunday, and they go and they come back and they say, oh yeah, I was wrong. And I think that learning that humility, that ability to be humble in your education, really in your personal growth in general, is what we're talking about,
Right.
is so significant. When I had a bookstore in the 1980s, and I remember I had a customer call up once for a particular book, because it was on a high school reading list when
Mhm.
they still read in high schools, and they need I think it was the mother needed a copy of the book because the kid was on the kids' reading list for the summer, and the phone call was taken by the woman who was running the cash register, and she called to me and asked me if we had the book, and I arrogantly corrected her pronunciation of the author's last name because I thought I knew better. And I realized not soon after that I was wrong.
Mm.
And I felt foolish, and I felt, incredibly humbled. This is an experience that I had that probably was, oh my gosh, close to 50 years ago. And I'm still talking about it now. And the book was Albert Camus' The Stranger.
Mm.
She said, do we have a copy of that? And I said, Camus. I said, what do you mean, Camus? Because I did not know it was pronounced Camus. I didn't know he was French. I don't think I'd ever read the book at that point. And so, the fact that there's always room for us to learn is a hard thing to process. I think it's part of our growth, right? Is understanding, as Socrates says, the one thing I know is I don't know anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good way to go into things.
Well, yeah, the cloud of unknowing, if you look at it as a metaphor, it's maybe we should all have a cloud of unknowing around us. And that's the humility. I had written down the exploration of the concept of divine love, contemplation, and the pursuit of God through a state of unknowing. And it seems like there's so much in there when you talk about the cloud of unknowing, and then you can talk about how, whether it's having humility about a book coming in or teaching a class, like it's I guess it gets back to the idea of the negative theology that you said.
Yeah.
Like it's so important to come from that angle, and I didn't even really think about that angle or have any idea about that angle, but it's imperative to understand.
Yeah. It's as I've said. When I teach a seminar,
Yeah.
I tell my students, I say, I don't know everything. I want you to bring what you know to the class. I said, I may know more than you do about this topic, but it doesn't mean I know everything about everything.
Right.
And I want that, as I've always talked about, again, going back to Socrates, that teaching is a cooperative search for truth. But it's interesting because so much of what the cloud of unknowing is about almost unlearning what we learn, how we learn to do this.
Right.
Because in some ways, and it sounds cliched, but you've got to let go. And we struggle with that on a daily basis, I think, of letting go.
Yeah.
Some of it is some of it is letting go and letting your intuition take over.
Right.
But in this case, the cloud of unknowing is asking you to let go, to make space for the divine to enter. That is, as long as there is all of that clutter, and how did he refer to it in the prologue, and that in Walter's great translation, he called them, fault finders, tittle tattlers, there's all this just crap going on.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you gotta let that go, because otherwise you can't make space for the divine to come in. And so much of what I think is interesting about this book, and it's the other thing that I found interesting as I went through my own underlining in the text, is how focused he is on the potential, on our potential, that we're looking at the fact that everyone really has this potential. It's just a matter of whether or not, again, you ready yourself for it and you prepare yourself, because it is a process. And the potentiality of ourselves is something which really interests me. It's big in Jungian psychology, of course, as well. And the idea that we oftentimes seem to negate that potential and think, oh, no, right? I'm not good enough for that. I run into that in my job here, trying to find students who want to do research. And I really want to get those students who are first generation college. We have a large contingent of them. And they're the ones who oftentimes come in thinking, oh, no, I can't do that. And so it's really a matter of teaching people to embrace their potential.
It seems to me when we investigate this text that it's really close to a lot of Eastern ideas about Buddhism and stuff like that, and letting go. And was there a closer tie in that particular time, or how do you?
There's a lot of discussion about whether or not the two traditions intersected in any kind of real way. It seems unlikely until you get into the 15th and 16th centuries, when the age of exploration and travel really kicks in. So, by the time you get to the 16th century, you've got, Jesuits, for example, going to China. And so there obviously is a lot of crossover there. Prior to that, it's kind of unclear whether or not there is a lot of connection. I mean, obviously there are thematic and content connections, but whether we can trace those and say, oh, well, the author knew this text, but we can't do that. We don't know. I just think what it comes down to is that, this journey, and that's what's so great about Underhill's book, is the mystical journey, the way that it's presented applies regardless of what religious tradition you're looking at. It works for Christianity, it works for Judaism, works for Islam, it works for Buddhism, it works for Taoism, it works for Hinduism. It works across the board. That idea of illumination, purgation, and union, and that's what's so nice about the way that she writes about it, is she's not talking about, union with the Christian God.
Right.
It's union with the divine. That's why I keep referring to it that way, because whatever your concept of the divine might be.
There seems like there does seem to be this thread, if we pull on it, that getting away from the conditioning that you've been taught your whole life is in itself a wonderful experience. And it allows you to see clearly in a way, which is almost divine in its own way.
Yes. But by the same token, I do believe that there's an importance to having that foundation, even if it's a foundation that you need to do, major renovation on, right? Because without the foundation, it's like, and what do you have to build on?
Right.
You're starting from scratch. And so, I don't want necessarily the student to come into my Bible as literature class and say, oh, I don't know anything about the Bible. I've never even looked at it. It's like, that's just as bad to me as the student who comes in and arrogantly says, oh, I got this. That's the two ends of the spectrum, and that's not what I'm looking for, right? I want somebody who has some familiarity with this, even if it's just from a cultural level, and on a cultural level, and is able to. I mean, the most fun I have with teaching really any text in any course is talking about ideas with students where you see all of a sudden a change in their thinking occurs. It's like, oh, I never thought about that before. It's like, yep, good. Let's think about that a little bit. What does that mean? And that may, and I think that for a lot of people who would have approached the Cloud of Unknowing, particularly in the 14th century when it was written, they would find this antithetical to what they've been taught, which is the way to get to the divine, the way to get to God is by studying, by praying, by being very active. And this author is saying that's not really going to work. It's only going to get you so far. Then you got to let go. And I don't think a lot of people are ready for that.
What do you think it is that is different in the person that is ready for it versus the person that's not ready for it?
I think it's a combination of preparation and experience. Right. I mean, as the Cloud author talks about, you need to be prepared. So there are stages that you have to go through. There are things that you have to experience. As Underhill would say, I mean, you need to go through that purgation stage.
Right.
But there also is a big part of it that has to do with experiencing life.
Yes.
And experiencing existence. Because without those experiences, I don't know what you bring to the table. I mean, in a couple of weeks, I think we're going to look at I forget. Are we looking at the book? Yeah, you want to do the book of Marjorie Kemp.
Right.
Marjorie Kemp, incredibly interesting woman, an incredibly interesting book. But what an odd existence she had prior to her initial experiences, as we'll talk about. I mean, this is first of all in the 14th century. She's a woman writing about this, which is unusual right from the get-go. And so, a lot of the texts that we're going to look at, I think, with maybe two exceptions, are written by men. And there is a tremendous amount of difference between the two approaches, which has been studied widely in the mystical literature in academia. The difference between the feminine and the masculine approach to this, it's very, very different. But we'll talk about that when we get to those texts. But I do think it's experience.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the Cloud author has lived a life of experience. I mean, he does not tell us what it is, but the way that he talks to us about going about this journey indicates to me that he's experienced stuff. He's had experiences. And the interesting thing is that something like Richard Roll's The Fire of Love, which I think we're going to look at maybe next week, I forget, it's autobiographical. And so he's telling us about his own experiences as he's going on this journey and the ways in which his life as a human being, as a man particularly, are kind of intersecting and butting up against his desire for union with the divine. Because the two of them don't go together. It's why there are still lots of Christian orders that live cloistered existences, nuns and monks. There is a need to distance oneself from a secular existence to really engage in this kind of work. And I think that still is appropriate today. I mean, we can do this work individually as we are, but I don't think we're going to achieve it in the same way or achieve the same sense of completion that someone does who is leading a kind of a cloistered life. And that cloistered life, has always intrigued me. And there are people who still do it today. I mean, a lot of people would say that academia is, that's what became of the cloistered life in the secular world was working in higher education. And that's why, most of the older universities go to Cambridge and Oxford. I mean, you walk around them, they look like churches.
Mhm.
That's not an accident. Those and of course the folks who taught there in the Middle Ages lived there. So they did, live that kind of life and devoted to the life of the mind. And I would say that, as I mentioned, I mean, I have a good friend who's a Cistercian monk in Massachusetts, so I know him and some of the other guys at the monastery pretty well over several decades now, and they are not living a life of the mind. I would say that they're living a life of the soul. I think there's a difference there. And it's not that they aren't engaged in intellect. It's that that's not their focus. Their focus is the soul. Whereas the focus for folks in my line of work in higher ed, our focus is the intellect. We're not necessarily negating the importance of the soul or ignoring it, but the mind it has dibs, right? It comes first. Excuse me. And that's just an interesting dichotomy in our world. And to think about, how many people in the Middle Ages and up until, Henry VIII came along in England, engaged in that kind of life by being in monasteries and it's really kind of amazing. Now that number is dwindling globally, not just in the U.S. My friend's monastery, which is one of the most successful in the Cistercian order, as he calls them, the boys are all getting old. They're dying off, and there aren't enough people coming in, and so a lot of the monasteries are closing down. One of the Cistercian monasteries, one of the big ones in the Midwest, I forget where it is. I think they're going to close down because there aren't enough guys. There aren't enough people who choose to lead that kind of life, who choose to pursue the cloud of unknowing rather than whether it's the almighty dollar or, knowledge. I had to laugh before we came on air. Somebody had posted a link to a YouTube video. Pee Wee Herman died the other day.
Right.
And apparently he was on the Dating Game in 1979. The video is on YouTube. It's hilarious. It's hard to believe. I was watching it, shaking my head, thinking this couldn't have been 1979 because it seems, it's so incredibly sexist and misogynistic. It seems like it had to have been, 1959, but it wasn't. It was 1979. But the reason I bring it up is, why did I bring that up? I lost my complete train of thought.
But we were talking about more people are choosing not the cloud of unknowing, but they're choosing a different life, be it the almighty dollar.
Yeah. And this is what struck me. One of the contestants said that his big goal in his biography when they introduced him was to make money. That's it. It didn't say anything about what profession he wants to go, what he's doing. His goal is to make money. He did not get picked. Neither did Pee Wee Herman, unfortunately. But I was just so struck by that when the introduction of him was that, he wants to make money. And that's what a lot of people focus on. And as we know, look at the chapter of my book on the 7 deadly sins,
Right.
Avarice is not a good thing. Gordon Gekko was wrong. Greed is not good.
Yeah, it's almost a jump off point for our society when we decided to unbuckle ourselves from real meaningful events versus the illusion of meaning,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting
Yeah.
to think about.
And it's something which it seems to me has occurred dramatically in the U.S. since the end of World War II. There's been such a shift in our focus on what's important, and it's difficult, for people who even want to go back to focusing on what's important. It's a difficult thing to do, given the world in which we live. Um, it's hard. It's hard.
It's interesting. We're talking about the manuscript, the Cloud of the Unknowing. And in today's world, we're all downloading our stuff to the cloud. And
Mm,
to an alien group, they'd be like, look at this Cloud of Unknowing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's not that dissimilar, right? I mean, he says in the text, it's not a real cloud in the sky.
Right,
And
right,
when you talk to people about the cloud, they say, you talk to somebody who's older about the cloud. My information lives in the cloud. They're
right.
like, where's that? It's like, well, it's not a real cloud.
Yeah.
And so, there is an interesting aspect to that, because he does talk in the text about the role of imagination in all this. And in some ways, the imagination can get in the way of all of this, because you use it, and it serves as a barrier. At one point in some of the middle chapters, I remember he goes through the different faculties and talks about why they're all, the significance of all of it, starting in chapter 63, where he talks about the mind. 64, he talks about reason. 65, he talks about imagination. He says imagination is the faculty by which we can picture anything, past as well as present. Both it and the means by which it works are contained in the mind. I mean, this is amazing stuff
Yeah.
for the 14th century. Before man sinned, he says, imagination was so obedient to its master, reason, that it never pictured anything that was perverted or fantastic, physically or spiritually, but not so now. For it is not restrained by the light of grace in the reason, for if it is not restrained by the light of grace in the reason, it will never cease, waking or sleeping, to suggest diverse and perverted ideas about the world around us, or some hallucination, which after all is only a spiritual idea conceived in material terms, or a material one conceived in spiritual. And this is always counterfeit and false and akin to error.
That is, whoo.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because it picks right up on something which occurs. I've always been intrigued by this idea of faculty psychology, that your mind has these separate faculties. And in John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is retelling the story of the fall, it's really, in some ways, Eve's imagination that gets the best of her. And God is constantly telling Adam and stressing the importance of reason. Reason is chief. Reason, he says, I gave you as an umpire. At one point, he says. So if you're battling about a choice, go to reason. And the problem for Eve, in what happens to her in that particular text, and the way that she's tempted by the serpent, by Satan, is that it's her imagination that gets the best of her. She lets her reason fails. Her reason, she's been told, don't eat the fruit, you're going to die. The serpent comes along and says, oh, you're not going to die. I ate the fruit, and look at me. I can talk, and I can walk upright. And of course, the problem is she never saw him do that. She's relying on what he said. And then he puts all of these ideas into her head about how she'll be able to fly like an angel. And the imagination gets the best of her. And so she takes a bite. It's interesting, because imagination is so important. But very clearly, in faculty psychology, it has a funny kind of a spot, because and Shakespeare does this in Hamlet. He even talks about it in Hamlet, right? When if you remember, Hamlet and Ophelia has gone crazy, and she's out there talking all kinds of crazy things in the street, and it gets reported back to the king that she's doing that. And the line is something to the effect of, the rabble, the people hear what she's saying, and it doesn't make any sense. It's just gibberish, but they take it and they use their imagination and they put it into an order that makes sense to them. And so they're perverting what it is that she's saying. It's an interesting problem.
A tale of sound and fury, completely devoid of any.
Told by an idiot. Yeah.
Dr. David Salomon, we could probably go for another hour, but you got a hard line coming up, and I want to make sure that you make that.
Thank you.
How fast did this go? Are you kidding me? Right? It's so much fun, and I really love the direction in which we were able to navigate, and I'm going to go back and have to re-listen to it because there's a lot of parts I want to highlight and rethink on.
I'm glad.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people
find it interesting. It's a pretty esoteric topic.
It is, but I think that there's a thirst for it, especially now more than ever. And I really think we are reaching an audience of people that want to learn. And we may be the only resource they have right now. We may be the esoteric gateway into a world of faculty imagination. You know what I mean? So I'm thankful for that. So
I wonder how many podcasts are out there talking about topics like this. So we are unique, are we not?
We are, of course.
And next week we'll do Marjorie Kemp.
Okay.
The book of Marjorie Kemp for next week. We'll talk about.
Let's do that.
That's a good one.
And on the topic of books, you have a tremendous one that you and I went through here, the 7 Deadly Sins. And for anybody who found this particular conversation to be enlightening or beautiful or fun, I highly recommend you check out Dr. Salomon's book, The 7 Deadly Sins. It's incredible read. You'll come out being a better person and have a better understanding of it. And you got another book coming up. Maybe you could I know you're short on time, but maybe you could talk a little bit about where people can find you, what you have coming up, and what you're excited about.
Yeah. So my website is David A. Salomon, SALOMON.com, and you can find my books, my speaking stuff, my just about everything up there, including my consulting. What I'm excited about, I continue to be excited about teaching in the fall. The fall semester is coming quick upon us. Our first day of class here is 3 short weeks away. So we are preparing and everything that goes along with that. So I really, I love doing that and getting ready for a new class and a new course. And I've also got a whole new group of students coming into the university, so I can talk to them about doing research and creative work. So I'm excited about that as well.
You know, I'm excited. And didn't you win an award recently? Didn't you get
yes?
Can you share that with people? I think that's amazing.
Our new president, who has just come on board, is a former rear admiral with the Coast Guard. He just resigned his commission and retired, and he is our incoming president of the university. And I had him at an event last week, which was the conclusion of my summer scholars program, where students are doing collaborative research with faculty over the summer. And he came to the event, which was lovely, with his wife, and said a few words, which was very nice. And then he called me onto the stage and he presented me with a challenge coin. He explained what it was. And for folks who aren't familiar with the tradition in the military, Google it. That's what Uncle Google is there for. But I was incredibly flattered. And he said I was the first faculty member that he had given one to. So it's sitting here on my desk, and I'm really, really humbled by it, speaking of humility.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm excited for you, and I'm excited to see everything you got coming up and talk to you in the future. Now I'm holding you almost past your time. Thank you so much for today, and I will talk to you soon. Well, next week, Marjorie Kemp. Ladies and gentlemen, aloha.